Before we begin today's talk, I want to clarify something important. This lecture is not intended to attack a particular person. It is not designed to shame individuals, nor is it a psychological diagnosis of someone's personality flaws. The purpose of this talk is much more fundamental. We are here to understand a recurring human pattern, a type of person who appears again and again in families, workplaces, organizations, and communities. A person who does not always create conflict directly, yet somehow conflict constantly forms around them. A person who claims neutrality, yet quietly shapes the emotional climate between people. A person who insists they are only passing along information, yet relationships fracture in their wake. Today we will examine what I call the distorted messenger. Understanding this pattern is not about judgment. It is about awareness. Because in life, we cannot always avoid such people. But if we fail to recognize the structure of their behavior, we may become entangled in it emotionally, morally, and psychologically. And when that happens, something strange occurs. Even after the relationship ends, the mind does not let go. Many people say things like this: the relationship is over, but I keep thinking about it. Was I too cold? Why am I still angry? These reactions are not signs of immaturity. In fact, they are signs that the mind is trying to complete something that was never properly finished. In psychology, this is called an unresolved relationship. Human beings do not simply need an ending. They need understanding. But with certain types of people, understanding never arrives. There was no clear apology, no clear acknowledgement, no clear resolution of what truly happened. The conflict simply dissolved into ambiguity. And because of that, the emotional residue remains. Interestingly, after distancing themselves from such individuals, many people experience something unexpected: guilt. Not the person who created the distortion, but the person who walked away. Why? Because morally conscientious people are trained to believe that relationships must be maintained. They have spent years trying to preserve harmony, trying to be patient, trying to explain. So when they finally let go, their own conscience whispers, was abandoning the relationship immoral? But here is the critical distinction. Guilt is not always a signal of moral failure. Sometimes it is simply the echo of a responsibility we have been conditioned to carry for too long. An ancient Buddhist text known as the Tibetan Book of the Dead expresses this idea in a remarkable way. Explaining the light to a consciousness that cannot see it is not compassion. It is attachment. In other words, there is a point at which explanation stops being kindness. It becomes compulsion. A compulsion to make another person understand. A compulsion to justify ourselves. A compulsion to prove that we were right. But true letting go does not mean suppressing emotion, and it does not require dramatic declarations of forgiveness. Instead, it involves three quiet decisions. First, the decision to stop explaining. Second, the decision to stop proving. Third, the decision to stop making the other person's understanding your goal. This is what genuine release looks like. When you finally recognize that some people were never meant to be understood. Only observe something inside you shifts. You begin to see relationships differently. You start noticing patterns instead of words, repetition instead of emotion, structure instead of intention. And this shift is not cynicism. It is maturity. From the perspective of the Tibetan Book of the Dead, experiences like these are a kind of training of consciousness. They teach us how to stand in clarity, even when others remain in confusion. How to avoid becoming trapped in emotional in-between spaces. How to keep our center even when someone else is operating from ignorance. Because here is one of the strange truths about human conflict. Most of the time, we do not meet people who simply create conflict. We meet people who maintain their identity through conflict. Conflict becomes the stage on which their role exists. And one of the most fascinating things about this type of person is where they position themselves in social structures. If you observe carefully, you will notice something unusual. These individuals rarely become the president of the organization. They rarely become the CEO. They rarely become the final decision maker. Instead, they gravitate toward the middle: secretary, coordinator, administrator, auditor, operations manager, roles that sit between power and execution. This is not accidental. It is structural. Many people assume such individuals avoid leadership because they lack ambition, but that assumption is wrong. They do not dislike power. They dislike responsibility. When someone becomes the leader of an organization, two things become clear: who made the decision and who is accountable for the outcome. If things succeed, the leader receives praise. If things fail, the leader receives blame. For a personality structure that thrives in ambiguity, this clarity is dangerous. So instead of standing at the front, they remain in the corridor between authority and information. From there, they hold something extremely powerful: the flow of information. They do not command people directly. Instead, they control which message reaches whom when it arrives and how it is framed. And once someone controls the gateway of information, they can influence emotions between people without ever appearing responsible. A leader must speak publicly, but the person in the middle can whisper, and whispering is an incredibly efficient way to shape perception. This is also why such personalities are often attracted to roles like auditor or inspector. Psychologically, these positions offer a seductive privilege. They allow someone to point out problems, to evaluate others, to question decisions. Yet they do not require carrying the burden of solving those problems. The structure itself communicates a subtle message: I am correct. The issue belongs to someone else. Ancient Buddhist philosophy often distinguishes between two kinds of power: the power that stands in front and accepts responsibility, and the power that operates quietly from behind. This personality structure almost always chooses the second. Why? Because when power acts from the front, the chain of cause and effect becomes visible. But when power acts from the middle, responsibility becomes blurred. This is why such individuals often remain in what we might call the psychological middle realm, between decision and execution, between fact and interpretation, between speech and action. From this position, they can exert influence for a long time while remaining relatively safe. Occasionally, however, such a person does become the leader. And when that happens, the pattern usually becomes obvious. Decisions are delayed, responsibility is diffused, structures become unnecessarily complicated. Eventually, trust erodes because the personality that thrived in the middle struggles when placed in the open. You see, these individuals do not necessarily want to be the king. They want to be the person whispering in the king's ear. And throughout history, many of the greatest confusions within organizations and society have not started from the throne, but from the quiet space beside it. So when you encounter someone who is always surrounded by conflict, yet never seems responsible for any of it, do not focus only on what they say. Look at where they sit, because in social systems, positions reveal character more honestly than words ever will. Seats rarely betray the nature of the person occupying them. And once you understand that structure, you gain something extremely valuable: the ability to step out of the game entirely. You do not need to win the conflict. You simply refuse to enter the arena where it is manufactured. And sometimes the greatest clarity in life begins with a single, quiet step backward. Because as the Tibetan Book of the Dead reminds us, only those who know how to depart can see the next path clearly. The relationship ends. The structure becomes visible, and your consciousness quietly, almost invisibly, has grown deeper. So once you begin to see the structure behind these personalities, something interesting happens. You stop asking the emotional question: why did they say that? Instead, you begin asking the structural question: where does responsibility actually belong? And this shift in perspective changes everything. At this point, I want to move away from theory for a moment and talk about something more practical, something drawn directly from real life. Because many people ask me the same question: if you encounter someone who distorts your words and spreads conflict, how should you actually respond. So today I want to share a personal experience. Over the years, working in different organizations and social environments, I have encountered this type of personality more than once. You may recognize the pattern. There is a person who moves quietly between people. They take something you said or something you never said and deliver it to someone else in a distorted form. The person who hears the message becomes angry. Arguments begin. Relationships fracture. And when the conflict erupts, the messenger calmly steps backward and says, "I didn't do anything. I only passed along what I heard." For many people, this is an incredibly frustrating experience. And if you have spent enough time in social organizations, workplaces, or community groups, chances are you have encountered this pattern at least once. Now here is the interesting part. When this happened to me, I did not confront the person who distorted the message. Not once. I never argued with them. I never demanded an explanation. Instead, I chose a completely different approach. I confronted the person who acted on the distorted message without verifying it, publicly, directly, and very clearly. In front of others, I asked a simple question. Why did you act on information that you never confirmed? And then I stated something equally direct. Your words and your actions are your responsibility. That was the entire conversation. There was no prolonged conflict, no emotional debate, no ongoing argument behind the scenes. Because by that point in my life, I had already learned something important from years of social experience. Confronting the distorting messenger rarely accomplishes anything. Why? Because people who operate through distortion usually follow 3 unspoken rules. They do not speak directly. They avoid leaving records, and they never accept responsibility. The moment you try to argue with them, you are already inside their arena. If you become angry, you lose. If you try to explain yourself, you lose. Even if you ignore them quietly, they can still manipulate the narrative. So I made a deliberate choice. I refused to engage with the messenger at all. Because the real issue was never who said the words. The real issue was who chose to act on them. In social life, hearing something is rarely the problem. The problem begins when someone hears a rumor, skips verification, reacts emotionally, and attacks another person. At that moment, responsibility shifts, not to the messenger, but to the person who turned a rumor into an action. That is where accountability truly belongs. And so that is where I placed it. Something interesting happened the next day. The person who had reacted emotionally came to me and apologized. Now, many people might assume that happened because I raised my voice or intimidated them, but that was not the reason. What they realized in that moment was something much simpler. They understood that in front of me, one excuse would not work anymore. The excuse that says, "Well, someone told me." They realized something important. Even information that comes from someone else still carries personal responsibility once we choose to act on it. There is a remarkable philosophical insight that parallels this idea in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. The text suggests something subtle about moral causation. It proposes that the person who throws confusion into the world is not always the one who accumulates the deepest consequences. Sometimes the greater responsibility belongs to the person who grabs that confusion and turns it into action. Think of it this way. The distorted messenger throws a seed, but seeds do nothing by themselves. Only when someone receives the seed, nurtures it, and allows it to grow into behavior, does it become something real. At that moment, the consequence belongs to the one who cultivated it. That is why I did not chase the person who threw the seed. Instead, I addressed the person who allowed it to grow. This was not an emotional reaction. It was a structural response. And because the structure was clear, something interesting happened inside me afterward. There was no lingering obsession, no mental replay of the argument, no feeling that I should have said more. No late night thoughts like, I wish I had explained myself better, because there had been no emotional exchange with the messenger at all. No debate, no defensive explanation, no attempt to persuade someone who had no intention of understanding. In Buddhist philosophy, particularly in the perspective reflected in the Bardo teachings described in the Tibetan Book of the Dead. There is an idea about avoiding what might be called the middle realm of confusion. This middle space is where people become trapped, trying to justify themselves, explain endlessly, or prove their innocence. But wisdom sometimes lies in refusing to enter that space at all. Not arguing, not persuading, not chasing. Simply refusing to participate in the structure where distortion operates. Let me summarize the principle clearly. Directly fighting a distorted messenger almost always ends in frustration. But doing one thing differently changes the outcome entirely. Holding accountable the person who believed the distortion without verification and acted upon it. That is not revenge. That is the restoration of order. What I did in that situation was not suppression of anger. It was not avoidance. And it was not weakness. It was the deliberate choice to cut the structural chain that allowed distortion to function. And once that chain is broken, the entire dynamic collapses. So in these situations, the critical factor is not courage. It is direction. The question is not, who should I fight? The real question is, where does responsibility truly belong? Once you understand this, social life becomes much simpler because you stop chasing shadows. You start addressing structures. And when you see the structure clearly, emotional manipulation loses much of its power. Now that we understand how distorted messengers operate and how responsibility actually flows within these dynamics, we are ready to go one step further. Understanding the pattern is only the beginning. The next step is learning how to detect this personality early, before the damage spreads. Because these individuals almost always reveal themselves through subtle signals, long before conflict erupts. And they often operate through what we might call the intermediary power structure inside organizations, positions where information, interpretation, and influence quietly converge. In the next lecture, Distorted Messengers Part 7, we will explore the early warning signs that reveal this personality type, the intermediary power structures that appear just before organizations begin to fracture, and practical methods for observing and responding without becoming entangled. Because wisdom in social life is not about changing other people. It is about recognizing structures and protecting your position within them. If this lecture helped clarify something you have experienced in your own life, consider subscribing and sharing the video. Sometimes the most valuable knowledge we can offer each other is simply the ability to see what was previously invisible.